great to have you all on board today. And we're going to be looking very much at what's happening. We're going back to school very, very shortly. Some of you will already be back. So it's getting into that and what do we do? What do we need to do? And having Andy's expertise to share would be fantastic. Can I just ask, first of all, number one, if you've got anything, questions and stuff like that, put them on the chat. We'll be doing questions and answers at the end. There'll be a specially extended session for that to ask Andy anything you need. But could you just put your names up, whereabouts you are coming from in the world, because we've got people from all over the world on this session today, just so we can get a kind of familiarity and you can start exchanging with each other, because it's not just what we say, it's what you make of it. And I'm going to just go straight on over to Andy and say, Andy, let's go.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Hi, everybody. My name's Andy Griffith. Those are my contact details there via email and on Twitter. This is downloadable, this presentation at the end as well. I'd love to meet you in person someday, but this is the remit I've been given by Osiris. We're going to be thinking about how we get our staff feeling ready for the new term, how we get maximum whole school engagement. So I'm talking about staff and students, and how we motivate students for the new normal. Very quick CV from me, in case you haven't come across me before. I'm a former full-time teacher. I've written a few books and education packs, some of which you might have heard of. Engaging Learners and Teaching Backwards are bestsellers. As a part-time teacher, I ended up working quite a lot with organisations like the BBC and Comic Relief. But I've mostly been working hard on something called, creating training courses that make a big impact in different settings. So We've created 2 courses with Osiris that are modular in nature. The Outstanding Teaching Intervention, that's called the Osiris Teaching Intervention, and Excellence Through Leadership of Learning. I'm very, very proud of both those 2 courses, and the presentation I'm going to talk about today, the threads running through this presentation, of which there are 3, very, very much run strongly through these courses. So guys, what I'm going to talk to you about today in terms of re-engaging teaching learners is 3 areas. First of all, about building collective efficacy. Secondly, we're going to talk about managing cognitive load. And thirdly, closing perception gaps. So those are the 3 sections we're going to look at. Let's start off by talking about building collective efficacy. I'm sure everybody on this webinar is aware of the work of Professor John Hattie and around his effect sizes. If you're not, then get up to date with John Hattie. He works exclusively for Osiris in the UK, and Hattie is the top statistician, the number cruncher that tells us of all the things that we do as teachers and leaders, which makes the most difference. And as we can see from this graph, that collective teacher efficacy, that sense that we can do it, a bit of a Bob the Builder mentality, is the absolutely key thing that can make the biggest difference on student learning. And actually, when you see some of the other big indicators there, self-reported grades, teacher estimates of achievement, there's a lot to do with beliefs that are key to what makes a successful school. So I want to drill down into this sense of self-efficacy first of all. Efficacy ultimately is a belief that you can accomplish things. So if you say, for instance, as a leader, and I'm sure you do have experience of mastery moments, so you have those moments of success, you're good at doing something, you get feedback from that, and then you end up sort of like thinking, right, I can do it again. So I think in the first few weeks back, it's going to be really important as leaders that we praise people that are doing things well. And the type of praise that I would recommend is something called descriptive praise, which is, I really like the way you ... I really like the way you're doing this. And that first few weeks back, even if you're seeing faults, we're trying to praise the people that are doing the right things on your teaching staff. The second one is vicarious experiences. As you know, Stephen, I put people together on training courses in groups so that we can learn from each other. And when you see someone else succeed, it's rather infectious. And what we want to be doing then is modeling the sort of things that we want our staff to be doing in those first few weeks. That's going to be absolutely key. The third one is verbal experiences. Very, very important that we get the right type of talk and language in the first few weeks going back to school. For me, all transformation is linguistic, and how we convey that we've got a can-do attitude, that we're future focused. Even that language of build back better is absolutely crucial, and our staff need to hear that as a lot along the way. And finally, you'll all be aware of this metaphor, I'm sure. Some people are drains, some people are radiators, some people light up the room when they come in, some people, the room lights up when they go out. It's really, really important that we develop those sort of psychological and emotional states, mindsets, if you like, attitudes that can really help to develop that. Now, what the research tells us about collective efficacy is that when you build collective efficacy, when you create this we instead of me language in schools, and it really builds individual self-efficacy. And Stephen, you know that a lot of my work has been about trying to improve the bell curve of quality in schools, of teachers and leaders, and push that to the right. So that's a little bit of thoughts from me about that, and how we can perhaps push ourselves towards that that sort of standard that would really have that high effect size that Hattie was talking about.
And I think why it's so important having you on here, Andy, is that you're working with schools where this isn't necessarily the ideal situation. Relational trust might not be as high as it possibly can be. It's really difficult to see this when you're in an outstanding school, but when you get into a school where it's obviously missing, it starts to become very difficult to build. So that practical building is going to be really useful to share with people.
Yeah. I don't really want to say too much about myself today, but I mean, basically, all you need to know if you're watching this is that I like a challenge. I see myself as a learning designer. So whether I'm working with schools in special measures or prisoners, as I was working with this week in a jail in Liverpool, and I'm a great believer in simplicity. Change is complex and change is hard, but I try to strip away the jargon and give people practical tools as much as possible, Stephen, as you know. Okay, so one really practical tool is adopting Stoic philosophy. Those of you who's not come across Stoicism before, I'm going to try and explain this in plain English, how I make use of it as a sort of philosophy. It's part of, I guess, how I work as a person. And Stoicism is a pretty big subject, but if you're completely new to it, all you really need to know is that it was a school of philosophy founded in about the 4th century BC by a guy called Zeno of Citium. Now, what I'm finding actually is that a lot of Stoic principles are absolutely crucial in a crisis situation. And basically, Stoicism is a philosophical worldview with a specific set of ethical values. The Stoics used to call them virtues. So actually being emotionally resilient and, you know, that sort of notion of life's what you make it, don't complain, don't worry about things you can't control. What matters is how we respond to things. So, you know, you're going to have some people in the body of staff, not just teachers. You've got teaching assistants, you've got your canteen staff, you've got your cleaning staff, your admin staff. Some of them are going to come back and be perhaps stressed, rightly so. But what we've got to do as leaders is manage that by modeling how we control our emotions. And, you know, my personal views as a society, I think we've become a bit fragile, okay? And we shouldn't expect life to be easy. Life is fundamentally hard, and the Stoics certainly believe that. So I think adopting some Stoic philosophy would be a really, really good thing in the first few weeks back. And I'll say a bit more about it if people want to ping me some questions. You'll also, I'm sure, be aware that in times of adversity, people stick together more. This is a great opportunity. I don't know if some of you, like me, have worked in some tough schools. I've worked in places around the country that are very tough schools to work in for different reasons. But actually, a tough situation can really galvanise the staff. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the work of Simon Sinek, the sort of leadership writer, but I really like his work. And he talks about this golden circle. And it's really important that we are clear, all of us in our organisations, why we do what we do, the big why. And a lot of times we might think that we're clear as leaders, but perhaps we could be a lot clearer. A lot of organisations talk about what they do and how they do it, but why they do it, and everybody's sort of singing from the same hymn sheet there is absolutely key. And I'd massively recommend him. So all I'd say about that, and I could do a whole week's course on collective efficacy, Stephen, but the first few weeks back, I'm leaving you here some reflective questions, not to reflect on now because you won't have time, because I'm going to zoom along this at 100 mile an hour, but to take back to school. How can we make our school community more stoic or even anti-fragile? Stephen, you'll be aware of the work of Nassim Taleb's latest book, Anti-Fragility, or Anti-Fragile as it is. It's not about coming back to the old norm or going back or being even strong or robust. How can we actually use this time to come back better and to be better learning community? How can we be sure that our community is clear about the purpose of why we exist? And how can we build opportunities to develop efficacy at all levels? So that's a few things to sort of think about there. Just that first third of the presentation for me. Do you want to add anything, Stephen, or?
Maybe just worth the anti-fragile element has got three elements to it. Either you've got a fragile response, which I think most people can guess, which is obviously where the stoicism bit comes to overcome. The second one he talks about is a robust response, which is great. But it's trying to get back to the old normal, if you like. It's using an awful lot of resources, willpower, workload to hold what was the old normal. An anti-fragile response he talks about is something that's actually building back better, so it feels better. So we're practice, for example, in the online and the distance learning, so we know what actually works and makes an impact. It's not how do we engage the kids, it's how do we actually make an impact within that environment. So we've almost got a switch that it doesn't matter which one we click between, because we know from the research it doesn't matter, but it does matter to certain groups of learners, which is where we'll talk about a little bit more.
A lot of what I think, my work's been about is trying to change teachers, and a lot of that is about changing teachers' routines and habits. You'll see on screen here a lot of the sort of strategies about getting students to be more independent of their teacher. Like 5-minute I'm stuck plans, using help desks, using metaphors like the learning pit, has really transformed teachers, the way they think about it. And, this is a really important time, isn't it, Stephen, for students to be more independent in case there is a second spike or a second wave, etc. And I know that's something that's dear to your heart as well. The second area I want to talk about, guys, is managing cognitive load. First of all, I'm going to start talking about teachers' cognitive load, and then I'm going to talk about students. I don't know if you've got a lead in your house like this or a drawer like this full of leads, but what I know, I think, is that, and it's sort of counterintuitive, way that actually the many solutions in life that make life easier is about removing things rather than adding things. And what I try to do when I work with schools is get them to recognize actually that what stops some people improving is that they're suffering from something called cognitive or processing overload. It's something that we talked heavily about in our last book, The Learning Imperative. This is when someone is overwhelmed with information. And we're living in an information age. We also have a finite working memory that we have as human beings. So what we have to do is manage that well. Just as an aside, part of my research for the book was talking to people and working with people outside of education. And one guy who's a friend of mine, actually, who's a barrister, actually says that the weaker the case, the more he tries to cognitively overload the jury. Now, we don't mean to cognitively overload our staff by giving them initiatives and ideas and activities, etc. But a lot of my work is about stripping things out. A lot of my work with leaders, with teachers, saying, right, let's just shut some things out, let's just bring some things together, so we've got a greater sense of where we are with things.
I think one of the things, Andy, just to come on there, that we're noticing from the research is this big movement towards research-informed education and stuff is great in terms of there is lots of research out there, but what we're seeing is not much is changing with the practice of teachers as a direct result of engaging it. And certainly the research in that particular element is quite weak. And I think that's got a lot to do with the cognitive overload issue, whereby the teaching model isn't perhaps that secure in a teacher's mind. And then suddenly we're trying to add on all these other layers, and then they don't really go anywhere because they haven't got something to go into, which I'm sure is where Andy's
and there's a strong research. I'm a bit of a ready, fire, aim guy, Stephen, as you know. I go out there and roll my sleeves up, make things happen, but we've had over 50 schools using our programs go up Ofsted levels now, which I'm really proud of. But actually, as leaders, especially when we're enthusiastic leaders, we can accidentally sometimes overload our staff. Now the causes of cognitive overload are these: lack of shared clarity being one of them, ineffective prioritization, poor time management being others. We might perceive that everybody's clear, but in the hustle and bustle and the fast pace of schools, perhaps we could do a bit more on that. And I'll suggest some ideas in a minute. What I think we've got to be really careful of in the next sort of few months is burnout. I don't know if anybody on this webinar have ever had burnout before. I've had burnout in my career a couple of times. I'm the sort of person who can burn out because I'm like 100 miles an hour. And a lot of stress is good. You know, we need to be able to manage stress. It gets us up in the morning. But when people are overly stressed through cognitive overload, it wastes a lot of energy, and it can affect goodwill and certainly affect the quality of teaching, their performance level. So I'll offer some suggestions, Stephen, if that's okay, how you can reduce cognitive overload. Now, I'm going to share some strategies that I use as a learning designer around teacher training, and you can perhaps adapt these to your context as you see fit. So I'm going to, first of all, infographics. Infographics, seeing a picture of something that has got a finite amount of information is easier to digest than tons of words and policy documents. Okay, so your head of art might be given some overtime here. Sequencing and being specific about the sequence you want things done in. Something called leveling up, so we're clear about what makes high level compared to medium and low. Checklists and efficient time management and other systems. So, Stephen, you'll be familiar with this. My old Big Four, or what's sometimes known as FACE, I created an infographic back in about 2005, and I still stand by it. I think there's only 4 things you need to do to be a really good teacher. And although I'm talking about engagement today, you know, if I'm training people in engagement, I'll be talking about intrinsic motivation, the importance of teacher clarity, which has got a very high Hattie effect size, Stephen, hasn't it? And the importance of flow. And there's a lot of theories out there that come and go, but I love Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow. I think it stands and has stood the test of time. And we get flow when we have high challenge, but we've also got a positive attitude and the skills to be able to meet that challenge. So in a way, I teach backwards from flow, and those infographics make things clearer when I'm talking or presenting. When we did the research behind teaching backwards, which was finding award-winning teachers and deconstructing what they do, we tended to find that the best teachers go through the same type of sequence of thinking and practice. That they set high expectations, find out what kids can do before they do it. A blue Peter teachers are very clear with them and demystify the destination as they're going along. Are very, very good at formative assessment and being teaching detectives, set the right level of challenge and get the right level of feedback at the both and regimes in the classroom. And from that sequence, what we ended up creating, this, by the way, Stephen, of all the work I've ever had published, has been the most useful, people tell me, is the Teaching Backwards Topic Planner. If anybody online wants a copy of it, we'll send you one. And it's double-sided. It gives you, and there's a video tutorial on the Mallet website how to use it as well. But people love working through that. I've done so many inset days where we look at a topic and we go through those systems. And even if you don't do it in that sequence, it's logical. And actually, if you're sitting next to a higher performing teacher who uses that sequence, there's a lot of learning there.
I think it's worth saying, Andy, that this is the design element, because I think as we've moved a lot online, people will have noticed that the prep time has kind of doubled on a lesson, because you've now got to be much more precise in how you're using that time. And that's the same with developing staff, and this is what people don't kind of always get, because they're so busy in their day-to-day lives and what's happening. They're then running sessions with staff, with pupils, but running straight into them rather than just taking that time out and then putting a logical sequence like this.
Well, absolutely. But prep time is much, much quicker if you get in the habit of doing things the right way. Like you should always pre-assess. Okay. You should always show students what they're aiming at. Okay. You should always do that before we think about differentiation. That's what the great teachers do. And the quicker you get in the habit of doing that, like I've seen NQTs execute this brilliantly, Stephen, and I've seen teachers 25, 30 years in So planning speeds up when you do things the right way. Now, leveling up. I've got here some levels for engagement that we use on the Osiris teaching intervention course, but it could be levels for anything. We've got levels for metacognition, levels for teacher clarity, whatever. But by doing this, it helps to give greater clarity to people, because some people can perceive that they're doing something at a level that perhaps might not be the reality. So checklists, we've got checklists at the end of chapters of Teacher Backwards. You could have checklists for things you need done in the school for the next few weeks. I do a lot of training, both inside and outside of education, on time management. As you know, Stephen, lots of middle leaders in particular are pushed into middle leadership and never really trained properly how to organise things. So this is a Kanban system, which we do a lot of work on training, so that you don't get overwhelmed by the only things you put in action is what you can complete in the next 24 hours. And it's just a really, really good system. Trello's another one that we recommend. And then this is literally straight out the Stoic playbook, really. Let's just really think in the first few weeks back of what we can control, what we can influence, and what we can't control. We can't control government sending us information at 2 o'clock in the morning, or thousands, or not sending us information. But let's just get that sort of us galvanize that, so we don't end up wasting energy and moaning about things, worrying about things that we can't control. I want to talk about students' cognitive load now briefly, if that's okay. And I've been massively impressed with, for me, the best teachers are teachers who practice what they don't know it, perhaps are unconscious of it, but they're excessively clear. Lots of teachers think they're clear, but until you see a teacher who's excessively clear, you don't realize perhaps that you've got some room for improvement in how you do your things. So I'm going to talk about a few things here that can reduce the cognitive load of students. And by doing that, it means there's more opportunities for them to go back, retrieve things that they've had previously been taught, and they can move on quicker in their learning. So we're going to talk about dual coding. I'm going to talk about the art of explaining and why it's really, really crucial today, and how we can train students to use supports. I'm also a great believer in KISS with 3 S's. Keep things Sesame Street simple. The clearer you know something, the more you know something, the more you should be able to present it to children clearly. So let me just show you 3 quick examples of things I think are really good practice. So this is from John McCarthy's book, So All You Can Learn. So it's been really interesting. Stephen, I've been, I still work with young people, as you know, and I've been sending them work to do during lockdown. But this teacher has said to them, right, this is what I want you to do, and this is how much time I want you to spend on it, which I really like. We've got here Mark Esner, who's a brilliant writer, geography teacher, author of Teach While Nobody's Watching. What he's saying here is, right, okay, guys, I want you to make revision cards here. Okay, I want you to do this is in the form of a mind map. He's very specific about how he wants things done. And I train students as well, especially teenagers. And if you're a parent listening today, this is a great website to go on, Wait But Why. And I do quite a lot of work with teenagers about the teenage brain and all that sort of stuff, prefrontal cortex. I try to train teenagers that are 100 blocks of 10 minutes in a day. So when a teenager says to me, oh, I haven't got a chance to read that thing before the lesson, sir, or I haven't got time to do a workout, that's just nonsense. Because when you ask a teenager to colour in their previous day, you'll get some quite interesting areas. So those are just 3 examples, actually, of where if you train students and are very specific with them about what you want them to do and how you want it to do it, you're going to get better outcomes. And some people think that they're being as specific as they can be, but I think that they can be more specific and more clear. Many teachers have got into dual coding notes for students. So this comes from a teacher called Andy Ryan. And if you create dual coded notes, which is a combination of pictures and words, which are proven by cognitive scientists to be easier for students to remember, you can derive from this a set of notes in children's exercise books or text or files that they can, self-quiz from, or you can create, your own sort of quizzes. And I think because of social distancing and because of I mean, I tend to advocate quite direct instructional methods, Stephen, as you probably know, whatever age I'm talking about, primary or secondary. And that's not to say I don't walk around the class and interact with students, but actually we have to probably, there's a great opportunity now to master the art of explaining. And people don't realize actually that I think there's a really strong correlation about how good an explainer you are and how good a teacher you are. So there's a couple of examples here. That, you know, when you're explaining either in class or on video, because loads of staff have made videos at home, haven't they, to send to students, or they've used screencasts and things like this, which has been great, actually, because I think it's got them to think about taking a normal 1 hour lesson and stripping it down into sort of 20, 30 minutes, which is a good process to go through. But punctuating things with examples, adding words of explanation after key technical language, or breaking things down into first, let's do this, second, let's do this, third, let's do this, will make you a better explainer. And particularly when you watch yourself back on video, that can make a big difference too. I know most of the leaders watching will be keen for their staff to hit the ground running, and actually mastering how you use a visualizer is absolutely key. I own about 3 different visualizers. I've got a visualizer that's got a button called split on it, which is great because I can split the screen and can put 2 bits of work up there, or a piece of work and the assessment criteria. And it's fantastic tool. So I actually think that, you know, mastering the visualizer, mastering explaining enables you to do, for me, one of the simplest forms of teaching, which is going to really come to the fore at the moment in this crisis, which is I do, we do, you do. So teachers modeling something to their class, perhaps under a visualizer, how they would write a particular sentence or how they would tackle an exam question. Getting the pupils to do it themselves, and then sort of looking at how that compares to the teacher's way of modeling something, or the waggle that the teacher's presented, and then gradually move between, you know, these steps. And what we've found has a very high effect size, particularly with some of our weaker learners, is that fading of worked examples, or something called the guidance fading effect, is that we as teachers are pretty formal at the beginning of teaching someone how to do something, and then we gradually step away until they become more independent of that. So, you know, for me, that's something that we train a lot of teachers to do, encourage lots of teachers to do, to become better explainers. Part of that is about modeling out loud how they're doing something, and sort of modeling out loud helps to develop the metacognition of students, by making what's visible in a teacher's head, or sorry, invisible in a teacher's head, much more visible. So one of the things we talked about in teaching backwards is the importance of developing metacognition in youngsters. And you'll know from not just Hattie's work, but from the Education Endowment Foundation's work, that the quickest and perhaps cheapest way to develop the effectiveness of a learner is to develop their metacognitive ability. So regularly get in the habit of, before you do something with learners, explain how you're going to do it and why you're doing it this way. During, stop and pause and they say, this is why I'm doing it this way. This is how I want you to imitate me, for instance. And then after, unpick how we've done it, how we can do it differently, perhaps, how you might remember this process, is a key habit for teachers to get into. And while we're talking about more direct instruction, Stephen, that doesn't mean lecturing. It doesn't mean didactic. It gets a really bad name, I think. You know, I think if you saw me teach, I'm very much at the front, but I really want lots of interaction with students. I want lots of checking with them that I'm doing it, I'm getting it right for them. And I want to be able to listen to students responding back to me. So a very good strategy that I recommend to stretch learners, stretch them orally, stretch them cognitively, is show me, tell me, convince me. So show me your answer perhaps on your, you know, sterilized mini whiteboard. Tell me, right? But convince me, give me some reasons, give me some arguments. And that's a really good habit, again, for students to get into, as is something like point, because, therefore, however. Drill into them that Every time they make a point, you want them to expand it and develop it. And so we're listening. We've done some instruction, but we're listening that they're doing it back the right way we want them to do it. And there's always going to be greats out there. There's always going to be the Picassos who do it better than us. And we've got to give them free rein. But the vast majority of students really need strong guidance and doing things the right way. I mean, one thing I'd say really quickly, Stephen, for someone who's taught writing for years, I work with kids with great imaginations and great, but if you can't structure a story or can't use grammar correctly, that's wasted. And, you know, I want to help those kids get their stories out there. So the other thing I'm really keen on doing is trying to get students to, without any sort of sense of being patronizing, because I'm a working class lad and I work in a lot of, you know, working class areas. Let's recognize that, particularly if you're teaching an exam class, there's a game to be played here. Okay, we want the examiner to realize that we're really, really good. Notice I'm using we language here. We know our stuff. We're going to answer the question directly. So let's get practicing together. Let's talk as if the examiner can hear us. Let's say it as we're going to write it. Let's talk as if we are a scientist. Annotate this work the way I would have done it, or what would an expert have liked or disliked. Okay, so I've thrown quite a lot in that section, Stephen, about cognitive load for staff and for students. And I think the first few weeks back, for me, I'd be very, very conscious that we don't overload our staff. This is not the time for new initiatives. This is the time to take things away, remove things, you know, delay things, and keep it really, really simple. Just teach your class well. Try and get them to, you know, obviously we want to get the kids to come in, do the work in class and start doing the work more at home too. And, you know, managing cognitive load of every stakeholder in our community is going to be really key. So I hope, guys, there's some useful ideas there, and please ping me any questions or any further thoughts about that. Anything over to you, Stephen? Anything you'd add on that?
No, I think that was a really good review. I mean, the one question for me that comes out of this, Andy, is, look, there's loads of really good ideas and practical ideas. You'll work with staff. How come they don't take them on board? You know, what we've seen a lot of training is that, you know, staff will have all these inputs, will have shown them as leaders and stuff like that, but they'll keep reverting back to what the model was that they were using before. You've got massive experience of this. What goes on there?
Well, it nicely links on to my next thing, actually, and I think it's about perception to a large extent. I spend most of my time as a learning designer. I know that sounds a bit poncy, but I heard someone say at a conference once, so I thought I'll call myself a learning designer. I really want to take people on a journey where they learn something about themselves to make themselves better, and they enjoy the process. It will be challenging, and I've had people, you know, massively been challenged by the course I've been on, but I think we get them there in the end. But one of the things I think we could sort of say is that a lot of people are unconscious that they do things in a particular way. Does that make sense, Stephen?
Yeah,
I think they're doing something at a particular level. I think they're doing something
I think it's part of the psychological thing, isn't it, Andy, that we kind of wear these rose-tinted glasses, or in my case, so you always feel that, you know, what you're doing is right. It gives you a good view in the world, makes you want to get up and do stuff. But when we do perception tests, we know time and time again, particularly in education, they give us completely wrong readings, and this is very difficult. I mean, the government came up against it in terms of teachers' predicted grades, where I think on average 38% of teachers will over-predict grades, but only 4% will under-predict grades, which is quite difficult. But that's the same when we get back to teachers actually looking at their own practice. They necessarily want to see they're good. They tend to look for the feedback of this group of children who are with them and moving with them, rather than the whole group of children. And therefore, then, you know, that becomes that perception thing becomes difficult to work with.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent my career, certainly the last 20 years, you know, CPD is around making CPD made very, very practical and doable for teachers. And, you know, not just for your weaker teachers. I like working with really strong teachers as well to make them stronger. But can I just say that I ask two questions to teachers ultimately? Is one, do you want to be a better teacher? Right? And it's very, very hard to work with teachers who don't want to be better, or they go through the motions and pretend. I tend to find in schools of high self-efficacy, where there's a lot of trust and mistakes aren't a big thing, then most people do want to be a better teacher. But the second question is, do you know how to be a better teacher? And a lot of teachers don't know how to be a better teacher because of exactly what you said. They're not really clear about what that might mean. Now, guys, people watching, I don't know if you've got a pen and paper in your hand. If you haven't, don't worry. But I just thought I'd put a quick little activity in here for you if you can, only a 10-second one. So could I ask you, if you've got a pen in your hand now, to draw me a flower? Just draw a picture of a flower. If you haven't got a pen in your hand, just imagine a picture of a flower if you would draw it. Stephen, you're drawing one there.
I'm drawing one nicely, yeah.
Okay, so does your flower look like this? That's the question. So it might, or it might not. So the flower I had in mind was a flower called a canna. By the way, I'm not a particularly a horticulturalist, etc. But I would think that most people draw a basic flower that looks a little bit like a daisy, which has got little sort of a round bit and sort of leaves around the side. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think what I try to do, Stephen, is help people with perception gaps. Now, I don't know if you're aware of. I'm sure you are aware of Dunning-Kruger effect, but the Dunning-Kruger effect is a well-established psychological effect that would suggest to us that some of us have got a greater sense of competence than is a reality. Sadly, some of us live on Mount Stupid. We're deluded and think that actually we're much better at something than we really are. Now, if we want a school to be a lot better in terms of reality, how good are, then we need to be really, really good at certain things. So some of the things that I've helped schools to establish is a video analysis culture. I mean, we've been at the vanguard of this, Stephen, haven't we, since 2005. We've been videoing teachers in such a way that they actually enjoy the process. They get a lot of learning from it. That they learn about things that they weren't conscious of before because of the very unique way that we use that approach.
Yeah, I think it's worth unpicking that, Andy, why it's so different. Because I think it's the sheer amount of variables in a classroom. And we've done a bit of analysis here on what's the difference between a proficient teacher and a highly skilled teacher. And when you get to those high levels of expertise against lower levels, and a poor teacher is only handling about 150, 200 variables a lesson, most of it to do with what they're projecting out. A highly skilled, we reckon, is anything up to 10,000 variables in that hour. So it's incredibly nuanced. So just by videoing the whole lesson, you're not able to look at all these bits. So what we've learned over this period of time is how to focus on the one thing that's likely or most likely to bring that success.
Absolutely. I mean, also what we do, we build on people's strengths. And, I think it's very, very hard to expect someone to change unless they see the reason for the change for themselves. That's my big criticism with Ofsted. It's a done to process rather than a done with process, and people need to see that themselves. I mean, what I would say is that in the video analysis side, I've seen over 2,000 teacher videos in my career and given feedback with the teacher, but we always get the teacher to watch it first and to annotate some questions so that they come in much more receptive to feedback rather than someone coming in who's given them feedback and they haven't even watched it. We also do a lot of work, and this is becoming really popular in schools now, Stephen, building teacher portfolios. So there's students' work there, models of excellence. A really good way of closing a teacher's perception gap who thinks they're better than they are is when they compare what their children are doing with another teacher, what work they're creating. And we do that in a way that, doesn't, belittle people. It's just a way of building a teams. Teams is the way to go in schools. You build, that's the unit of change, I believe. Teams in schools, departments, phase teams. And when we get teams sharing and working with each other and visiting teams in other schools and other contexts, you'll get greater quality there. But for me, the biggest thing that helps us find our blind spots as leaders, and I think, that's who I'm talking to today, is feedback. I would urge you to crave feedback. In the first couple of weeks back, get feedback. How can I do things better? And I've always been a great believer in that. You can never learn anything less by being completely open to feedback. And, you're modeling being open to feedback, modeling that sort of, change.
Right, I'm just.
I'd say I spend a lot of time, working on my own perception as well. I mean, how good a teacher am I? How good a trainer am I? You can only get true reality of that by looking at data, by looking at feedback and inviting that feedback. I mean, for me, the ability to evaluate one's own ability is the most important skill of all. And if you're not very good at that, then we need to put processes in place in an organization to make that more likely. I think it's a gift, actually. If it helps someone to see truth rather than their reality, then I think that's a real gift. I just wanted to finish on something that I feel very strongly about, Stephen, if that's okay, which is, again, links with perception. I think some of us have got the perception, not many, I don't think, that the pre-pandemic, the education system was good. And I think it's failing lots of our children. I also think it's failing lots of our teachers. I think there's been a massive opportunity for teachers to slow down. The teaching profession has been heavily criticised by some newspapers, but everybody I know has gone away and learned, video software, all sorts of stuff. They've been amazing in lockdown, which doesn't surprise me because that's what our profession's like. But, there's a couple of, books that I've read and, things that I've contributed to that I just sort of think that we need to think very strongly about coming back from this in a better way. And I admire, people that are very much campaigning for the forgotten third. Like Marcus Rashford, the footballer, successfully campaigned for, free school meals over the summer holidays. But I thought I'd show this to people if you weren't aware of it. Teacher Tap is, a free app that poses questions, and you answer them, as they're sent along. And this was sent out in March, just I guess at the beginning of lockdown, really, Stephen, wasn't it? And you'll see as you go down from, each of these sort of segments, as you go down these quintiles in terms of, free school meal children, they're becoming less and less affluent as you go down. It's unsurprising because there's lots of barriers. But the more socially deprived you are, the less likely you're doing the sufficient work at home, perhaps not even any work at home. Now, some of those were attitudinal, some of those were, family situations, some of them was lack of equipment. But if there's ever a reason for why, then that's it. It doesn't have to be necessarily that the child is socially deprived, but what we're here to do, we've got a debt as educators to children who don't have perhaps, great backgrounds. And, talking about the heroes of, the NHS and all these other people, I think it would be absolutely heroic to come back in the next few weeks and really try and switch these kids on, back to a higher level of learning than I had previously, and find some subtle ways for that. So if anybody wants to contact me about engagement or any ideas about engagement, you've got my email address on the slides there. I'll be happy to talk about that. So I'll leave you with these last 3 reflective questions, really. Let's spend the first few weeks, reducing cognitive load and get people to do things the right way. Let's be specific about what that is. We know there's a right way now for washing hands. There's a right way now for perhaps, distancing, but let's do that for other things as well. Let's help everybody manage their anxiety and take a stoic approach to this. Let's take a can-do approach, recognizing that there's lots of things that are out of our control, but how we respond to anxiety will be a great way of modeling to our staff. And actually, let's set ourselves a target of getting through this first few months and then not just going back to the old normal, but trying to build back better to a school that's in a much better place. So I hope I gave you the remit there, Stephen. That's what I've thrown together for the guys today. And there's, some of the things I've written there, and there's how you can contact me on Twitter. If you've liked the presentation, if you want to say something on Twitter, I'd be delighted. And there's my email address as well. But feel free to download those slides and use them with your staff.
So I've got some questions already come in, Andy. So if I can kick these ones off. The first one probably outside. Do I know the Guide Core platform, and do people out there know it in terms of facilitating teacher practice, teacher development? What I can say is we now work in partnership. I spent 15 years going all over the world trying to find a learning platform that would support CPD for teachers. Ridiculously hard to find because most of them are designed as learning management systems. It's a linear structure. Great for passing the qualification, but pretty useless for staff development when staff have so many ideas. So the Guide Core platform, we are now partners with Guide, and it is now the Osiris digital platform. So we're handling all their educational stuff. So yes, I do really embrace it, and there's some phenomenal stuff. Now we'll be talking about more of that in the next weeks. Second, someone was asking about lesson length, because this is a bit of a problem, Andy, and what you think your thoughts are on it, because obviously what an online lesson length is, what a school day, and this person was suggesting they're moving to 2-hour lessons.
I mean, I work across 4 different schools at the moment. You've got a person's name, Stephen, so I can.
I haven't. It was on a private message, so.
Okay.
I'm guessing they had some concerns about it.
Yeah. Well, one of the schools I'm working at is going to, I guess, like double lessons, so they're like an hour, sort of 40, almost 2-hour lessons. Yeah, I mean, I think, that's a logistical decision the school's making to obviously try to reduce, sort of social interaction and that type of thing. I think you just have to do, what's best for you. Now, if you want some thoughts on how to, for me, I would, if I was a teacher of a 2-hour lesson, break it up in a way so it is more easy for students to manage cognitive load. In our first book, we talked about this great strategy called 3-minute motivators. I don't know if you remember them, Stephen, but actually having something which is a physical break for 3 minutes and having some really good, tools up your sleeve for that can really help kids to get their sort of concentration back again. And we'll all drift in and out at different points. So in engaging learners, 3-minute motivators, but if anybody wants to email me afterwards, I've got a few free, or I can send them to Osiris, some examples of 3-minute motivators. So it's things they could do in their seats for 2 or 3 minutes. It gives them a little bit of a break, and then they're ready to go back to the next episode. So I would break the lesson down into sort of like episodes. You might pre-plan a break, but once you start using 3-minute motivators, you recognize actually sometimes you don't need to use one when you thought you did, but then you notice the class have just lost that energy, but it brings everybody back together. So I really like that sort of approach. So if anybody wants them, just let me know and I'll send you some over.
Yeah, and the research isn't definitive on the length of a lesson. So, and there are logistical reasons there, but I really like the episodes. In spaced learning, they kind of were working on the neurological research on it, and they said 20 minutes at a time, then break for 10 minutes. And they were doing modeling clay, any little games, but stop trying to teach at that point. If you do, the cognitive overload, what's going to happen is your behaviour problem's going to go up over that hour.
You won't get anything over 3 minutes in my recommendation as a break. But I think when you see a really, really good teacher at work, they go along at a good speed, but then they recognise in the room, they read the room and see where some kids are just drifted off and or they're overloaded. So they give them something to do as a little bit of a break. And some of the 3-minute motivators as well can also be turned into quizzes, and they can be used for retrieval as well. So a really nice strategy is, right, let's have a bit of our lesson today. Let's have a little sort of like 2-minute break. And let's have like a 5-minute quiz now on something from a couple of weeks ago. And there's some really cool quiz formats out there that, I'm aware of and I've sort of, trained in as well. So, for a long 2-hour lesson, you might want to be going back a little bit in terms of previous learning, going forward a little bit as well about, previewing what's to come. And hopefully students will buy into that. If you explain to them why you're doing it and you're transparent, kids are much more likely to go with you.
Lots of people have loved the 3-minute motivators, Andy, which is really good to hear. And someone was asking about Bounce Back Land. What is that? That is a program that just gets you to have a look for all the leaders, all the teachers, what you're thinking, where the parents are at, where the learners are at, what learning strategies are being employed, what teaching strategies are being employed, and pulls all that together so you get a real clear picture of where you're at in your school, what the deficits and gaps are, and what the research says on all this. I mean, I'm hearing an awful lot in the paper about in the news and media, learning loss. There was someone on Radio 4, Cambridge University professor, speaking about it, and they said definitively we've missed a third of the year. That will be the learning loss. We know it's not. We will not know the learning loss till we get those learners in there and actually really understand what they've retained. And learning happens all the time. It's not just what we're doing the lesson. That's the teaching part. It's how does that transfer? And what we're trying to do here with Andy of being so practical is the how do we make that learning? How do we turn that teaching into impactful learning? So, Andy, one of the other ones that's come up is a lot of people want the teaching backwards framework, and why not? Can you just explain how difficult that is, though, to get staff actually using it and the steps that you would go through to get them using it? We'll make it available for you. Just put your thing on there.
Okay, so, well, the teaching backwards framework, I think, let me explain how it came about. It came about studying excellent teachers who have had a proven impact in primary and secondary, measured by data and also measured by reputation as well, that they were really perceived to be excellent teachers. Some of them were actually award-winning teachers, but they tend to go through first of all of them have high expectations, and they build high expectations in kids. It's all well and good just having high expectations, but they've got a very clever way of building them, so it might well be the teacher that sort of says, right, don't give in his homework unless you sign it to say this is absolutely the best homework that I can do. If you don't, just give it to me tomorrow. There's hundreds of strategies like that. Pre-assessment, how you pre-assess and when you pre-assess is key. So our colleague who talked about the 2-hour lessons, you could take 5 minutes of that lesson to do a pre-assessment of something that's coming up in 2 weeks' time. You can do that in silence. You do it individually. You could use a knowledge grid. You could do a cold write, but you'd find out what kids can and can't do. And that's absolutely crucial for learners. And the best teachers do that. They don't make assumptions about learners. And that's different topic by topic. And then they're very explicit, Stephen. They're very explicit about what they want them to do, how they want them to do it. They show them at the beginning what a good one looks like. I show them at the beginning what excellence looks like. Or I show them at the beginning what a terrible one looks like, why it's terrible, and why it's never going to come across in this classroom. And there are hundreds of ways of doing that as well. And then they find very clever ways to assess how kids are doing in the process of creating their own version of, that story or that picture or that video, whatever they're trying to create. And they match the challenge to something that is beyond what every kid can do. So this is one of my passions, is working with able kids, especially in socially disadvantaged areas. And a lot of kids in that context will hide their ability. They'll but if you subtly pre-assessment and subtly find out what they can do, you can push them right from the outset of every topic. And then, it's about developing feedback protocols and norms that are very specific and timely and transparent for the learner. So the topic planner, if people want that, email Osiris. We've got the topic planner there. It does take time, Stephen. I reckon you probably need to do about 10 topics using the Teaching Backwards topic framework, and then you gradually, and then compare that to others using the same framework. But I was amazed. I go to some schools now who say, oh, we're a Teaching Backwards school. We're a Teaching Backwards school. And it builds on the work of Wiggins and McTighe's, work, understanding by design. So if you're interested in this process, it's about really being ultra specific what you want children to do.
But I think, Andy, it's worth saying, because everyone's on about rose and shine and as though it's something new. I mean, it does all rose and shine in one kind of thing, because we knew what the research was before.
Yeah, I mean, I've mapped it against all the 10 Rose and Shine's principles, and it maps across to that. I mean, but as I say, as a learning designer and someone who likes to write and create things, I wanted to create my own book. I wanted to create my own methodology based on 100 or so really great teachers that I've worked with or I found out about. And emailed and said, "Can I come and watch you teach?" And that's the sad anal part of me, that I love watching brilliant teachers teach, but I love deconstructing it and taking it away from, you know, theory and research is a bit cold. So yeah, Barak Rosenshine's stuff, absolutely fantastic. But if you haven't got Teaching Backwards, read it. There's loads of practical examples and case studies in there. And, you know, I'm so grateful for all the hundreds of teachers who work with me to help, you know, me and others become better teachers because of that shared brilliance.
Okay, well, in good practice time, we're bang on 5 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us.